The smallest act of kindness can change a life you know nothing about. Rain tapped steadily against the windows of the city bus as it rolled through downtown Chicago on a gray October morning. Most passengers stared at their phones or out the foggy glass, eager to reach work and escape the weather. Grace Mitchell adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag and stepped aboard just before the doors closed. Her dark beige coat was damp from the rain, and a few loose strands of hair clung to her face. She paid her fare, thanked the driver, and glanced down the crowded aisle. Every seat appeared taken, almost every seat. Near the middle of the bus, one spot remained open beside a man sitting quietly by the window. He wore an old navy jacket and carried a simple backpack that looked as though it had seen years of use. His shoes were clean but ordinary. Nothing about him stood out. Grace smiled politely and moved toward the empty seat. "Is anyone sitting here?" she asked. The man looked up. His expression seemed tired, though his eyes were attentive. "No. Go ahead." Grace slid into the seat as the bus pulled away from the curb. For several minutes, neither spoke. Outside, rainwater streamed across storefront windows, while people hurried beneath umbrellas. Grace opened the paperback novel she carried everywhere and began reading. The man beside her occasionally glanced out the window, lost in thought. A few stops later, the bus became even more crowded. An elderly woman stepped aboard carrying several grocery bags. She looked around, searching for a place to sit. Without hesitation, Grace stood. "Ma'am, please take my seat." The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you, dear." Grace helped her settle in before moving toward the aisle. The bus lurched suddenly, causing several passengers to lose their balance. Before Grace could grab a handrail, the man from the window seat stood and offered his place instead. "You can sit here," he said. Grace shook her head. "You were here first, and you gave up your seat first." She needed it more than I did. Exactly. For a moment they looked at each other. Then Grace laughed softly. "Fine. We can call it a draw." Instead of taking the seat, she remained standing beside him. The exchange seemed simple, but something about her reaction surprised him. Most people would have accepted the seat immediately. Grace appeared more concerned about fairness than comfort. The man smiled faintly. "I am Benjamin." "Grace." They shook hands briefly. The conversation might have ended there if not for another passenger who climbed aboard carrying a crying toddler. Every available seat was occupied. The mother looked exhausted. Grace immediately moved toward her. "Would you like me to hold your umbrella while you get settled?" The woman looked relieved. "Thank you." Grace took the dripping umbrella and helped fold it before handing it back. "Long morning?" she asked kindly. "Very long," the woman admitted. "I can tell." A few passengers smiled. The tension around the tired mother seemed to ease almost instantly. When Grace returned to her place near Benjamin, he found himself studying her differently. For the past 6 months, he had been traveling through cities without revealing who he was. As founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Industries, Benjamin Hayes spent most days surrounded by boardrooms, private meetings, and carefully managed conversations. He had started riding public transportation anonymously because he wanted to understand how ordinary people lived. More importantly, he wanted to understand whether genuine kindness still existed in a world increasingly focused on status and self-interest. What he had witnessed so far often left him disappointed. People avoided eye contact. They ignored each other. They rushed through life as if everyone else were invisible. Yet Grace seemed different. She noticed people. She paid attention. She helped without expecting anything in return. "You do that a lot, do not you?" Benjamin asked. "Do what?" "Help strangers." Grace shrugged as though the answer were obvious. "Everyone has bad days. That's simple." "Usually." Benjamin looked out the rain-covered window. "Most people do not think that way." "Maybe they do," Grace said. "Maybe they are just busy." The bus slowed at a red light. Across the street, workers hurried beneath awnings while traffic crawled through the storm. Grace glanced toward the cloudy sky. "My grandmother always says kindness is free." Benjamin smiled. "Wise woman." "Very." Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook filled with handwritten pages. She opened it briefly and scribbled something before closing it again. Benjamin noticed colorful tabs sticking out from nearly every page. "What is that?" he asked. Grace held up the notebook. "Just ideas." "For what?" "Ways to help people." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "You carry a notebook full of that?" "I know it sounds strange. Actually, it sounds interesting." Grace smiled. Maybe someday I will do something with them. Before Benjamin could ask another question, the bus approached her stop. Grace stood and adjusted her bag. "This is me." She offered a small wave. "Have a good day, Benjamin." "You too, Grace." The doors opened. She stepped out into the rain and disappeared into the crowd. Benjamin remained seated as the bus pulled away. For a long moment, he watched through the window until she was no longer visible. Then his gaze dropped to the empty space where she had been sitting. In a world where people constantly asked what they could gain, Grace Mitchell seemed to ask only what she could give. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the brief bus ride had already changed something inside him. Benjamin could not stop thinking about Grace Mitchell. By the time the bus completed its route and he stepped onto a downtown sidewalk, her words still echoed in his mind. Everyone has bad days. Maybe they are just busy. Such simple observations should not have stayed with him. Yet they did. Most conversations in his world revolved around profit margins, expansion plans, quarterly reports, and competitive strategies. People often spoke carefully around him, measuring every sentence. Grace had done the opposite. She had spoken honestly, naturally, as though kindness required no explanation at all. Later that afternoon, Benjamin sat in a private conference room 20 floors above the city. Senior executives discussed acquisition opportunities while presentation slides illuminated a massive screen. The numbers were impressive. The projections were strong. Yet Benjamin found his attention drifting elsewhere. A small notebook filled with community ideas appeared repeatedly in his thoughts. "Benjamin," one executive asked, "your thoughts?" Benjamin looked up. The room had fallen silent. Everyone was waiting. He offered a brief answer, approved the proposal, and continued the meeting. But the distraction remained. That evening he reviewed the notes from his ongoing Undercover project. For months, he had documented interactions across the city. Grocery stores, public parks, coffee shops, buses, trains. Most entries described people rushing through life without noticing one another. Then he opened a fresh page and wrote a single name: Grace Mitchell. Underneath, he added 3 observations. Offered her seat without hesitation. Helped strangers without recognition. Carries a notebook of ideas to improve lives. He stared at the words for a long moment. Then he smiled and closed the journal. The following morning, rain had disappeared, replaced by bright autumn sunshine. Benjamin boarded the same bus at nearly the same time. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps coincidence. Yet when he stepped inside and saw Grace sitting near the rear of the bus, something felt unexpectedly right. She looked up from her notebook and immediately recognized him. "Benjamin." "Grace." She smiled and motioned toward the empty seat beside her. "Looks like you survived yesterday's weather." "Barely." She laughed softly. "Chicago will do that." Benjamin sat down. This time conversation came more easily. They discussed favorite neighborhoods, local bookstores, and the strange habits people developed during long commutes. Grace mentioned the public library where she worked. Her eyes brightened when she described community reading programs and educational events. Benjamin noticed how passionate she became whenever the conversation involved helping others. "You really love your job," he said. "I do, even though it probably is not easy." Grace smiled. "Most worthwhile things are not easy." The answer impressed him. As the bus continued through the city, Grace reached into her bag and removed a paper-wrapped sandwich. It was not large, just a simple lunch prepared at home. She glanced toward Benjamin. "Did you eat breakfast?" The question surprised him. "Not really." "Neither did I." She carefully broke the sandwich in half and held out one portion. Benjamin stared at it. "You are offering me your lunch?" "Half of it." "You barely know me." Grace shrugged. "You look hungry." For a moment, he did not know what to say. In boardrooms, people competed for attention. In business negotiations, people protected every advantage. Yet this woman, who clearly was not wealthy, casually offered half her meal to a stranger. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace smiled. "You are welcome." They ate while the bus moved through morning traffic. Neither seemed bothered by the simplicity of the moment. To Grace it was probably ordinary. To Benjamin it felt extraordinary. At the next stop, a group of students boarded. The bus became crowded again. One teenager accidentally dropped a stack of papers across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Grace immediately helped gather them. A few passengers joined in. Within seconds, the problem was solved. Watching her, Benjamin noticed something fascinating. Kindness seemed contagious around her. One good action inspired another. People who might otherwise remain silent suddenly chose to help. When Grace returned to her seat, Benjamin nodded toward the notebook resting on her lap. "Can I ask about the ideas?" She hesitated briefly before handing it to him. "They are probably not as exciting as they sound." Benjamin opened the notebook. Page after page contained sketches, plans, and handwritten concepts. Mobile reading stations, community gardens, free tutoring programs, neighborhood events designed to connect people. None of them focused on money. All of them focused on people. Benjamin slowly turned another page, then another. The more he read, the more amazed he became. Because hidden inside that ordinary notebook were ideas capable of changing entire communities. Grace looked out the window, unaware of the impact she was having. Benjamin closed the notebook carefully and handed it back. "These are good," he said. "Very good." Grace smiled modestly. "They are just ideas." Benjamin glanced toward the passing city skyline. Deep down, he already knew something she did not. In the right hands, ideas like hers could become reality. And for the first time since beginning his undercover journey, he found himself wanting to help make that happen. Over the next several weeks, the morning bus became something both Grace and Benjamin quietly looked forward to. Neither admitted it, but each found themselves arriving at the stop a little earlier than necessary. Sometimes they talked the entire ride. Other times they simply watched the city wake up around them. Yet even during the quiet moments, an easy comfort existed between them. One chilly Thursday morning, Grace boarded carrying 2 cups of coffee. The bus was already half full. When she spotted Benjamin near the back, she smiled and handed him one of the cups before sitting down. "You remembered how I take my coffee?" he asked, surprised. "You mean with too much cream and not enough confidence?" Grace teased. Benjamin laughed. "That is surprisingly accurate. I pay attention." The simple statement stayed with him. Few people actually paid attention anymore. Most were distracted by schedules, phones, and endless obligations. Grace noticed details. She remembered conversations. She remembered names. More importantly, she remembered people. As the bus continued downtown, Benjamin noticed dark circles beneath her eyes. "You look tired." Grace hesitated before answering. "My grandmother had trouble sleeping last night." "Is she okay?" "She will be. Some days are just harder than others." Benjamin knew Grace lived with her grandmother, but she rarely talked about the challenges involved. "You take care of her by yourself?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Mostly. She took care of me when I needed it. Now it is my turn." Benjamin looked out the window for a moment. In his world, problems were often solved by hiring experts, writing checks, or delegating responsibilities. Grace solved problems by giving her time. The difference struck him more than he expected. Later that afternoon, after leaving the office where she worked, Grace stopped at a small neighborhood grocery store. She pushed a basket through the aisles, comparing prices carefully. Budgeting had become second nature. Every dollar mattered. As she reached for a loaf of bread, she noticed someone standing several feet away examining canned soup. Benjamin. He looked equally surprised. "Either Chicago is a very small city," Grace said, "or you are following me." I was about to say the same thing. They laughed. What began as an unexpected encounter turned into an impromptu shopping trip. Grace helped him choose ingredients after discovering he knew almost nothing about cooking. "You are 37 years old and cannot make a proper dinner?" she asked. "Apparently not." "That is honestly impressive." "Not in a good way." "Definitely not in a good way." By the time they reached the checkout lines, both were smiling. The conversation felt effortless. As they prepared to leave, Grace noticed a young mother standing nearby with a basket full of groceries and a worried expression. Her payment card had been declined. The cashier remained polite, but the woman's embarrassment was obvious. Without hesitation, Grace stepped forward. "How much is left?" The woman looked startled. "You do not need to." "How much?" After a brief pause, the cashier gave the amount. Grace quietly paid the difference. The mother looked close to tears. "Thank you." "It is okay," Grace said gently. "Everyone needs help sometimes." As the woman left, Benjamin stared at Grace. "You barely know her." "That seems to be a theme lately." "Grace." His voice softened. "You cannot help everyone." She considered that for a moment. "Maybe not." Then she smiled. "But I can help one person at a time." The answer followed Benjamin home that evening. Sitting alone inside his penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, he replayed the moment repeatedly. He thought about the grocery bill, the bus rides, The notebook full of ideas. None of Grace's actions were dramatic. None were designed to attract attention. That was exactly what made them powerful. The next morning, Benjamin boarded the bus, carrying something unusual. A small notebook. When Grace sat beside him, she immediately noticed it. "What is this?" she asked. Benjamin held it up awkwardly. "You inspired me." Grace laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "Probably." He opened the notebook to the first page. Written neatly across the top were 4 words. "Ideas worth trying." Grace smiled. "You started your own notebook." "I did. Let me guess. Community projects?" "Maybe. See? You are learning." Benjamin found himself smiling back. What he did not tell her was that he had already shared several of her concepts with a private team at Hayes Industries. Not under her name. Not for publicity. Simply to see whether they could become reality. Because the more time he spent around Grace Mitchell, the more convinced he became that her ideas deserved more than a notebook. They deserved a chance. As autumn deepened across Chicago, the bus rides became only one part of Grace and Benjamin's growing friendship. Their paths began crossing in other places too, almost as if the city itself kept bringing them together. One Saturday morning, Grace was organizing books for a neighborhood literacy event outside the public library when she looked up and saw Benjamin walking toward the volunteer tent carrying 2 boxes of donated children's books. "Please tell me that is not a coincidence," she said. Benjamin set the boxes down and smiled. "I heard they needed extra help. And you just happened to have 2 boxes of books? I may have planned ahead." Grace laughed. "You are getting suspiciously thoughtful." Throughout the morning, they worked side by side arranging tables, greeting families, and helping children choose books to take home. Grace moved through the crowd with the same kindness Benjamin had seen on the bus. She remembered names. She knelt to speak with children at eye level. She listened when people talked. What surprised him most was how naturally others trusted her. By noon, several volunteers had begun asking Grace for advice about future community events. She answered every question with enthusiasm, occasionally pulling ideas from the notebook she always carried. "You really think these programs could work?" one volunteer asked after reviewing a page of her notes. Grace smiled. "I think people want connection more than we realize. Sometimes they just need a reason to gather." Benjamin listened carefully. Every idea she shared matched the research his company spent thousands of dollars collecting. Yet Grace had reached the same conclusions simply by paying attention to people. Later that afternoon, after the event ended, they stopped at a small cafe around the corner. The place was modest, with worn wooden tables and large front windows overlooking a busy street. Grace ordered tea. Benjamin ordered coffee. For a while they talked about books, travel, and favorite childhood memories. Then Grace noticed him staring thoughtfully at her notebook again. "You keep looking at that thing like it contains government secrets." Benjamin smiled. "Maybe I am curious. About community gardens and reading programs? About why someone spends so much time thinking about strangers." Grace considered the question. "Because strangers are just people we have not met yet." The answer made him laugh softly. "You always have an answer ready." "Not always." Her smile faded slightly. "Sometimes I wish I had more answers for the people who need help." Benjamin leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Grace opened her notebook to a page covered with sketches. "There is an abandoned building 3 blocks from the library. I have always imagined turning it into a community center." She pointed to several drawings. "Free tutoring, job training workshops, a reading room, maybe even a shared kitchen." Benjamin studied the page carefully. "This is detailed. I know it will never happen." "Why?" Grace shrugged. "Money, permits, resources, reality." Benjamin remained quiet. Unknown to her, his company funded projects far larger every year. Yet he said nothing. Instead, he asked questions. How would the center operate? Who would benefit? What programs mattered most? Grace answered each one passionately. The more she spoke, the more convinced he became that her vision deserved a chance. A week later, Benjamin found himself sitting in a private strategy meeting at Hayes Industries. Senior executives reviewed charitable initiatives for the coming year. Normally, these meetings focused on public relations value and measurable impact. This time, however, Benjamin arrived carrying a familiar notebook page. A copy of Grace's community center concept. "What if we invested directly in neighborhood-driven ideas?" he asked. The room fell silent. Executives exchanged curious looks. Benjamin continued outlining Grace's vision without revealing its source. The response surprised him. Several leaders immediately recognized the potential. By the end of the meeting, a feasibility team had been assembled to explore possibilities. That evening, Grace boarded the bus carrying a stack of library materials. Benjamin was already there. As she sat beside him, she noticed he seemed unusually cheerful. "Good day," she asked. "Very good. Something happened?" Benjamin looked out the window briefly before turning back to her. "Let us just say I heard a few interesting ideas recently." Grace smiled. "Well, whoever shared them must be very smart." "I think so too." Neither noticed the elderly passenger across the aisle watching their conversation with amusement. To everyone else, they looked like two ordinary friends sharing another ride home. Yet beneath the surface, something important was changing. Grace was beginning to trust Benjamin more deeply with each passing week. And Benjamin was quietly building something that could transform not only her ideas, but both of their lives. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year. Cold winds swept through Chicago, and the morning bus windows often fogged from the contrast between the freezing air outside and the warmth inside. Yet despite the changing season, one thing remained constant. Grace and Benjamin still found themselves sitting beside each other almost every morning. What neither of them realized was that their friendship had quietly become the favorite part of each other's day. One snowy Tuesday, Grace climbed aboard carrying a stack of folders from the library. Benjamin immediately stood to help her. "You know," Grace said as she settled into her seat, "most people would pretend not to notice someone struggling with all of this." Benjamin accepted the folders and smiled. "Maybe I have learned from a good example." Grace laughed softly. "Careful." That almost sounded like a compliment. Maybe it was. The conversation drifted naturally from there. They discussed books, holiday traditions, and childhood memories. Yet as the weeks passed, Benjamin noticed something else. Whenever Grace talked about her future, she rarely included herself in the picture. Her dreams always focused on helping others, expanding programs, supporting families, creating opportunities. "What about you?" he finally asked one morning. "What about me? What do you want?" Grace looked surprised by the question. "I just told you." "No, you told me what you want for everyone else." She stared out the bus window for a moment. "I guess I have never thought about it that way." Benjamin did not press further, but the answer stayed with him. Later that week, Grace invited him to a holiday fundraiser hosted by the library. It was a modest event held in a community hall decorated with handmade ornaments and paper snowflakes created by local children. Families filled the room. Volunteers served hot chocolate. A local choir performed seasonal songs. Grace spent most of the evening moving from table to table, helping wherever she was needed. Benjamin watched quietly from the back of the room. Several times people stopped Grace simply to thank her. A retired teacher thanked her for organizing reading classes. A young father thanked her for helping his daughter discover a love of books. A grandmother thanked her for arranging transportation to community events. None of these people knew one another, yet all of them seemed connected by Grace's kindness. "She does this all the time," one volunteer told Benjamin. "Grace never thinks anyone is watching." Benjamin looked across the room. Grace was kneeling beside a child, helping repair a torn page inside a picture book. She was smiling, completely focused, completely genuine. In that moment, Benjamin understood something important. The world measured success by wealth, influence, and recognition. Grace measured success by people. That realization affected him more than he expected. A few days later, inside a private conference room at Hayes Industries, Benjamin met with the development team assigned to evaluate community projects. Detailed architectural sketches covered the table. Feasibility studies, budget estimates, operational plans. The abandoned building Grace had described months earlier was now at the center of an ambitious proposal. "The numbers work," one executive explained. "The neighborhood would benefit significantly." Another executive nodded. "We can begin acquisition discussions immediately." Benjamin studied the plans. Every major element came directly from Grace's notebook. Reading rooms, educational spaces, job training facilities, community gathering areas. Her ideas were slowly becoming reality. Yet he remained careful not to reveal the source. Not yet. Meanwhile, Grace remained completely unaware. Her days continued much as before. She worked at the library, helped her grandmother, rode the bus, shared conversations with Benjamin. If anything, She simply noticed that he seemed distracted more often. One afternoon, she finally asked about it. They were sitting in a small coffee shop near the library while snow drifted outside the windows. "You have been thinking about something for weeks," Grace said. Benjamin looked up from his coffee. "Is it that obvious?" "Very." He smiled. "Maybe I am working on a project." "A secret project?" "Something like that." Grace narrowed her eyes playfully. "You are mysterious for a man who claims to live a simple life." Benjamin laughed. "And you ask dangerous questions." For a moment, they simply smiled at each other. The warmth between them felt different now. Deeper. More personal. Neither said it aloud, but both felt it. As they left the coffee shop later that evening, snowflakes drifted gently beneath the streetlights. Grace pulled her coat tighter against the cold. Benjamin walked beside her in comfortable silence. Neither knew exactly where their friendship was leading, but both knew they would be disappointed if it ended. And somewhere across the city, hidden behind corporate meetings and confidential plans, the future Grace had once written inside a notebook was moving closer than either of them could imagine. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Grace almost deleted the email by mistake. The sender was unfamiliar, and the subject line sounded unusually formal. Community Development Initiative Announcement. Curious, she opened it while sitting behind the circulation desk at the library. Her eyes widened immediately. The city was hosting a public unveiling for a major neighborhood revitalization project. Community leaders, local organizations, and residents had been invited. What caught her attention was the address. The abandoned building she had mentioned to Benjamin months earlier. The very same building. "That is strange," she whispered. A coworker looked up. "What is?" Grace quickly shook her head. "Nothing. Just surprised." Throughout the rest of the day, she found herself thinking about the invitation. The timing felt odd. The location felt even stranger. By the following Saturday, curiosity won. She decided to attend. The event drew a large crowd despite the cold weather. Families gathered outside temporary tents. Local reporters moved through the audience carrying cameras and microphones. City officials greeted guests near the entrance. Grace arrived wearing her favorite winter coat and carrying the familiar notebook tucked safely inside her bag. The old building looked completely different. Fresh banners hung across the front entrance. Construction plans were displayed on large presentation boards. Something important was clearly happening. As she walked through the crowd, she searched instinctively for Benjamin. They had not spoken much during the previous week. His mysterious project had consumed much of his time, and their schedules had become difficult to coordinate. Still, she expected him to appear eventually. The event began with several community representatives speaking about neighborhood growth and future opportunities. Grace listened politely, though her attention kept drifting toward the building itself. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Today marks the beginning of one of the most ambitious community investments our city has seen in years." Applause spread through the crowd. This project would not have been possible without the vision and leadership of a remarkable organization. Grace folded her arms against the cold and continued listening. "Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of Hayes Industries, Mr. Benjamin Hayes." The world seemed to stop moving. Grace stared at the stage. Applause erupted all around her. People stood. Cameras turned. Reporters moved closer. Then Benjamin walked into view. Not wearing the simple jacket she knew from the bus. Not carrying a worn backpack. He wore a tailored dark overcoat and was accompanied by city officials, business leaders, and senior executives. For a moment, Grace honestly thought there must be another Benjamin Hayes. Then the giant screen behind the stage illuminated. A photograph appeared. The face was unmistakable. Benjamin, founder and chief executive officer. Hayes Industries. Grace felt her breath catch. Around her, hundreds of people continued applauding. She heard none of it. Every conversation they had shared replayed through her mind. Every bus ride, every coffee, every moment. Suddenly the pieces connected. The thoughtful questions, the mysterious schedule, the unexplained resources, the project he refused to discuss. Benjamin stepped to the podium and began speaking. Grace barely heard the first several minutes. She remained frozen in place, trying to absorb what she had just learned. Then something on the screen caught her attention. Architectural renderings appeared. Reading rooms, community spaces, educational programs, job training centers. Her heart began racing. She knew those designs. She knew those ideas because they came directly from the pages of her notebook. Benjamin continued speaking. Great communities are built when people are willing to invest in one another. The crowd applauded again. This center will provide educational resources, mentoring opportunities, literacy programs, and community services for thousands of residents. Another image appeared. Grace recognized it immediately. One of her original sketches. Simplified, refined, but unmistakably hers. Her eyes widened. Benjamin paused briefly before continuing. The inspiration for this project came from someone who believes that kindness should never depend on status, wealth, or recognition. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Several people around her turned toward the screen. The presentation moved forward before any names appeared, but the message was clear enough. Benjamin had not forgotten a single conversation. He had listened. Every idea she thought impossible was standing behind him in concrete plans and blueprints. Yet despite the emotion building inside her, another feeling emerged as well. Confusion, shock, hurt, because the man she trusted had hidden something enormous. And as Benjamin stood beneath the bright lights addressing the city, Grace realized she no longer knew whether she had been sharing bus rides with a friend or participating in a secret she never agreed to join. Grace left the event before it ended. The cold air outside felt sharper than before, but it was nothing compared to the confusion swirling inside her mind. She walked several blocks without paying attention to where she was going. Cars passed. Streetlights flickered on as evening settled over the city. None of it registered. The only thing she could think about was Benjamin. Or perhaps she should have been calling him Mr. Hayes all along. By the time she reached home, her grandmother was sitting in her favorite chair reading a book. One look at Grace's face, and she immediately closed it. What happened? Grace set her bag down slowly. I found out someone lied to me. Her grandmother studied her carefully. Lied. Grace sank onto the couch. Maybe not exactly lied. Maybe he just never told me the truth. Over the next hour, she explained everything. The bus rides, the friendship, the notebook, the project, the revelation that Benjamin was one of the most successful business leaders in the city. Her grandmother listened quietly without interrupting. When Grace finally finished, the older woman smiled gently. And what bothers you most? Grace frowned. The fact that he hid it. Only that. Grace opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Because deep down she knew there was more. The truth was that she cared about him. Far more than she wanted to admit. And learning that he had kept such a huge secret felt personal. I do not know, she said softly. The next Monday morning, Grace did something she had not done in months. She skipped the bus. Instead, she took an earlier route across town. It added 20 minutes to her commute, but she did not care. The thought of seeing Benjamin felt impossible. Unfortunately, avoiding him turned out to be harder than expected. 3 days later, he appeared at the library. Grace was shelving books when she saw him standing near the entrance. Several patrons immediately recognized him from recent news coverage about the community center project. They greeted him enthusiastically. Benjamin thanked them politely before making his way toward her. Grace's heart betrayed her by beating faster. Can we talk? He asked. I am working. Then I will wait. Benjamin, please. She looked at him carefully. For the first time since she had met him, he seemed genuinely uncertain. Not powerful, not confident, just human. Still, the hurt remained. I trusted you, she said quietly. I know. Every morning we sat together and talked. I know. You knew exactly who you were. Benjamin nodded. Yes. Grace folded her arms. Then why? He glanced around the library before answering. Because I wanted one thing money could never buy. What? An honest connection. The answer caught her off guard. Benjamin continued before she could respond. The moment people learn who I am, everything changes. Conversations change. Expectations change. Sometimes, even friendships change before they begin. Grace remained silent. When I met you on that bus, he said softly, you treated me exactly the same way you treated everyone else. That does not excuse keeping secrets. No, it does not. He accepted the criticism without argument. But everything else was real. Grace looked away. That was the problem. She believed him. The kindness had been real. The laughter had been real. The friendship had been real. If any of it had felt fake, walking away would have been easy. The community center, she said finally. Was that part of some test? Benjamin's expression immediately hardened. No, then what was it? It was me listening. Grace met his eyes again. You built something from my ideas. Because they deserved to exist. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the library filled the silence between them. Pages turning. Quiet conversations. Footsteps moving across carpet. Finally, Grace shook her head. I need time. Pain flickered across Benjamin's face, though he quickly hid it. If that is what you need, I understand. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it is worth, Grace, the best part of my day was never the project. She swallowed hard. Then what was? A small smile appeared. The seat beside you on the bus. Before she could answer, he walked away. Grace stood motionless long after he disappeared through the front doors. Because despite everything she had learned, despite every reason she had to stay angry, one uncomfortable truth remained. She missed him too. The weeks that followed were quieter than Grace expected. Benjamin respected her request for space completely. He did not appear unexpectedly at the library. He did not call. He did not send messages. In some ways, that made everything harder. Because without his presence, Grace found herself noticing all the places he used to be. The empty seat on the bus. The coffee shop where they spent snowy afternoons talking. The neighborhood streets where they had walked together after community events. One Saturday morning, nearly 2 months after the unveiling, Grace received another invitation. This one came directly from the city council. The community center project was ready for its official opening, and local residents who had contributed ideas were invited to attend. Grace stared at the invitation for a long time. Her first instinct was to decline. Her second was curiosity. In the end, curiosity won. The grand opening took place on a bright spring afternoon. The transformation was astonishing. The abandoned building she once described in a notebook had become a vibrant community center filled with classrooms, reading spaces, computer labs, meeting rooms, and gathering areas. Families explored the facility while volunteers guided visitors through the programs. Children laughed in the reading room. Teenagers toured the technology center. Seniors gathered in conversation areas designed specifically for community events. Everywhere Grace looked, she saw pieces of the vision she had once believed impossible. As she moved through the building, she noticed something unusual. Small plaques appeared throughout the facility. Above the reading room entrance was a quote she recognized immediately. Kindness costs nothing. It was her grandmother's favorite saying. Another hallway displayed a community engagement concept almost identical to one she had sketched months earlier. Even the layout of the tutoring center mirrored a drawing she remembered creating late one evening at her kitchen table. Grace stopped in the middle of the hallway. Suddenly she understood. Benjamin had not simply borrowed a few ideas. He had listened to everything. Every conversation. Every dream. Every detail. A volunteer approached with a smile. Have you seen the main gallery yet? Grace shook her head. Not yet. You should. Curious, she followed the signs toward a large room near the center of the building. The moment she stepped inside, she froze. Along the walls hung framed pages from the original project development process. Concept sketches, program ideas, community plans. At the center of the room stood a display featuring a familiar notebook page. Her notebook page, the one describing the community center for the very first time. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, inspired by the belief that every community deserves a place to belong. Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Then she noticed another plaque. This one carried a name, Grace Mitchell. She stared at it in disbelief. For months, she assumed Benjamin would eventually take credit for the project. After all, he had funded it, built it, organized it. Yet his name appeared nowhere in the gallery. Instead, every display celebrated the people and ideas behind the vision. I hoped you would come. The familiar voice came from behind her. Grace turned slowly. Benjamin stood near the entrance. Not surrounded by executives. Not accompanied by reporters. Just Benjamin. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Grace looked back at the gallery. You put my name here. Benjamin nodded. Because it belongs there. You built all of this. No, he shook his head gently. I funded it. There is a difference. Grace looked around the room again. Why? Benjamin smiled softly. Because good ideas deserve more than applause. The answer sounded exactly like him. Exactly like the man she met on a bus months ago. Not the billionaire. Not the executive. The man. For the first time since learning the truth, Grace allowed herself to see the entire picture. Benjamin never tested her. He never manipulated her. He simply listened when no one else did. And when he had the power to help, He used it. I was angry, she admitted quietly. I know. And hurt. I know that too. Grace met his eyes. But standing here, I finally understand something. Benjamin waited. You did not build this to impress me. No, you built it because you believed in it. A smile appeared. Exactly. The tension that had existed between them for months seemed to disappear all at once. Not because every mistake had been erased, but because understanding had finally replaced assumption. Around them, families continued exploring the center. Laughter echoed through the halls. Life filled every room. And for the first time in a very long while, Grace found herself smiling at Benjamin without reservation. Somewhere between a bus ride, a shared sandwich, and a notebook full of impossible dreams, they had changed each other's worlds. Now, standing inside a dream that had become real, both of them finally understood just how much. 1 year later, the community center had become one of the most successful local initiatives in Chicago. Every week, hundreds of residents passed through its doors. Children attended tutoring programs. Families participated in workshops. Job seekers received training and support. Reading rooms stayed busy from morning until evening. What began as a collection of handwritten notes inside a small notebook had become something real, something alive. And every time Grace walked through the building, she felt the same mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Life had changed in ways she never expected. Her role at the library had expanded into a leadership position overseeing educational outreach across multiple neighborhoods. Community organizations regularly sought her advice. City leaders invited her to planning meetings. Yet despite the recognition, she remained exactly the same person she had always been. She still rode the bus. She still carried her notebook. She still believed kindness mattered. Some things, however, had changed. Benjamin was one of them. Their friendship had slowly rebuilt itself after the opening of the center. This time it was stronger because it rested on honesty. No hidden identities. No unanswered questions. Just trust. They spent weekends visiting community projects, exploring bookstores, and sharing long conversations over coffee. The feelings between them no longer needed explanation. They simply existed. One crisp spring morning, Grace boarded her usual bus after finishing an early meeting. She found an empty seat near the middle and settled in beside the window. A few seconds later, someone sat down beside her. "Is this seat taken?" the familiar voice asked. Grace laughed immediately. "That depends. Are you planning to stay for the whole ride?" Benjamin smiled. "I think so." She looked at him carefully. "You seem unusually happy." "Maybe. That usually means you are hiding something." "Not this time." The bus pulled away from the curb. Outside, sunlight reflected off buildings and storefronts. For a few minutes, they simply watched the city pass by. Then Benjamin reached into his coat pocket and removed something small. A folded piece of paper. Grace looked down curiously. "What is that?" "Open it." She unfolded the paper carefully. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then recognition hit. It was half of an old bus ticket. Faded. Slightly worn. Preserved carefully despite the passing months. Grace stared at it in disbelief. "You kept this?" Benjamin nodded. "From our first ride." She laughed softly. "Why would anyone keep a bus ticket for a year?" "Because it reminds me of the day everything changed." Grace felt emotion rise unexpectedly. "You are serious." "Very." The bus continued moving through familiar streets. Around them, passengers checked phones, read newspapers, and stared out windows, completely unaware of the moment unfolding nearby. Benjamin reached into his pocket again. This time he removed a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened immediately. "Benjamin," he smiled nervously. For perhaps the first time since she had known him, the confident businessman looked uncertain. Human. Vulnerable. "I spent most of my life believing success could solve every problem," he said quietly. "Then I met someone who showed me that kindness could change things money never could." Grace felt tears gathering. Benjamin continued. "You changed how I see people. You changed how I see communities. Honestly, you changed my entire world." Several passengers nearby had begun smiling without fully understanding the conversation. Benjamin opened the box. Inside rested a simple, elegant ring. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress. Just beautiful. "Grace Mitchell," he said softly, "would you spend the rest of your life sitting beside me?" A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Then she laughed through the emotion. "That might be the strangest proposal in Chicago." Benjamin laughed too. I know. And definitely the most public bus ride I have ever taken. Also true. Grace looked at him, then at the faded bus ticket still resting in her hand. The same route, the same city, the same simple seat where everything began. Finally she smiled. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Applause broke out unexpectedly around them. Several passengers who had been quietly listening began cheering. One elderly woman wiped away tears. A teenager recorded the moment on his phone. Even the bus driver seemed to smile when the news reached the front of the vehicle. Benjamin slipped the ring onto Grace's finger. For a moment neither spoke. They simply sat together while the city rolled past outside the windows. Later that summer, they held a small wedding in the community center courtyard. Families from the neighborhood attended. Library volunteers attended. Children from tutoring programs attended. Grace's grandmother sat proudly in the front row. Above the entrance to the center hung a familiar phrase. Kindness costs nothing. Looking around at the people whose lives had become connected through a simple act of generosity, Grace realized how true those words really were. Because the most important thing she had ever given away was half of a sandwich to a stranger on a bus. And somehow, that small moment had returned to her as a future she never dreamed possible.